Today we have Isaac Sharp with us. And Isaac, you are a visiting assistant professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. I've actually been to Union once. I actually work for a seminary, a different seminary, but I have been to Union once. And I got to see like the Bonhoeffer bust and got to see like the big ass library and everything. It was pretty impressive. It felt like you were walking into something important when you walk into Union.
It is a thing. It's got the very castle-like, the old Oxford style thing. That
Right.
there's a lot of stuff that's been filmed here.
Right. I
Uh,
saw what's the Beautiful Mind, right? The
yeah,
John Nash movie.
yeah.
I saw that.
There's some of those scenes that back in the day they did. I think a couple maybe of the Harry Potter stuff
Oh,
around
really?
in
Wow.
maybe the dining hall or something like that. The
How about
Law and
that?
Order SVU is here all the time. So a pro tip: if you are watching Law and Order SVU and you see a scene set on a idyllic college campus quad, that's usually the Union Seminary quad, or
Really?
often is. One of the cooler ones recently is Maisel filmed a lot here
Hmm.
because the Tony Shalhoub character is a Columbia professor in that show, and so they
Okay.
used Union for a lot of that. So
How
anyway,
about that?
yeah.
Wonderful. Well, one of the other things that you do besides being a visiting professor of clearly the most like film theological school in the country, is that you recently wrote a book called The Other Evangelicals, and the subtitle is A Story of Liberal, Black, Progressive, Feminist, and Gay Christians and the Movement that pushed them out. The subtitle is a book itself right there. But my goodness, it is an incredible book, especially as somebody like myself who grew up in the evangelical world.
Uh
I feel
huh.
like a lot of the folks that listen to listen to the podcast also grew up in that world. They're kind of former evangelical folks. This is an incredible book to really get some sense about like the breadth of the evangelical tradition and to see like how horrific things are happening, like the horror of what's going on. But unbelievable book. But before we start talking about the book, I want you to be able to introduce yourself. So, who is Isaac Sharp to Isaac Sharp?
Yeah, no. Well, thanks first of all for having me, Mason,
Absolutely.
and good to officially meet. I think we have like probably virtually run into some same
Okay.
alleyways in the online spaces. There,
Did
to
did
mix
I say something
metaphors.
that got pissed you off or anything? Because that happens
No,
a lot, and that's always
I
great.
think
I mean,
we've probably in the circles we move and I keep an eye on the theology Twitter and
okay.
move in and out of those spaces. So I think we've probably been in some threads together a couple of times. I think. And yeah, so nice to finally officially meet
Yeah,
you, and thanks for
absolutely.
having me. As you said, I'm Isaac. I work here at Union, where I got my PhD. Also, I finished my PhD in 2019, and yeah, this book is the first kind of out there published result of my dissertation. So it
Mm.
is based on that, and yeah, I'm excited for it to be out in the world. This is a fun thing, getting to talk about something I spent way too long writing.
I would imagine so. Well, because this is your dissertation, I imagine like it's your first like published book, right?
Yeah, officially yes,
Okay.
as a single author. I have a couple of things that I like edited volumes that
Okay.
I did with um, one evangelical ethics that I co-edited with David Gushy, that is a kind of reader in different 20th century evangelical perspectives on ethics. And then I did another edited volume that was a festschrift for a past union president. But yes, this is the first single authored book by me.
Love it. Love it. Well, with that said, was there anything that you learned about yourself as you wrote your very first single authored book that maybe you didn't know about yourself before? Maybe you're like, wait, I had no idea that I had that in me.
Um, along the along the trajectory of the dissertation into the book, um, I what did I learn about myself? Because this is a long process. I think it was some that this would be, as I imagine, is not unique for anybody who does a PhD. That
Hmm.
it is you are signing on for a project that is going to take you many, many, many years to finish. And the fact that I now that we're on this side of it, the fact that I could do it, right, is something that I learned because I had never written, something this long and extensive before.
Hmm.
And here we are. It's out in the world. And so I guess I learned that I could write a book.
How about that? Well, on to the next one, I guess.
Yeah.
What did you learn, maybe historically or kind of factually, as you wrote the book? Obviously, this is very much like a history type of book rather than you making like some sort of theological proposals and whatnot. But was there anything as you were doing research where you're like, had no idea about that? I imagine when you write a book, like you already, for the most part, know a lot of the things that you're going to be writing about. But yeah, was there anything that you learned about while you were researching where you're like, wow, had no idea about that?
Yeah, so the yes, and it's in some ways came in waves because a lot of folks that as I've been doing some interviews and discussions about the book, ask, like, why did you write this? What motivated you to write this? Like, how did you start down this trajectory? And so answering that question in some ways answers this question, because it is the case that the wheels started turning on this subject for me at different points, but one impetus was working with David Gushee on this evangelical ethics book. We had to
Mm,
make, like, as you know, the assignment is to develop a reader in evangelical ethics. So then you have to ask the question: what counts as an evangelical ethicist? Who is an evangelical ethicist? Who gets to decide?
mm,
And so, in the process of research for that book, I started learning that this question of who is an evangelical and who's not an evangelical is not only fraught, which I had a sense of, but there's a history behind the debates and the
right.
struggle over evangelical identity that is much more complex and goes further back than I think most people understand, and even that I understood. And so some of the kind of discovery process was um, making the surprising realization that there are people who were making similar kinds of arguments that are currently happening in evangelical circles
Hmm.
decades ago.
Okay.
And that these folks, and just truly discovering these folks, right? Some of it was the case that realizing that there were these other, that there were these other evangelicals who were not the evangelicals that everyone knows and has heard about.
Hmm.
So I learned some of that was the initial process, and then along the way, I had breadcrumbs of certain places to look, but then following those breadcrumbs, ended up finding even more interesting pieces of the puzzle and more interesting folks in the story. So
Well, it's funny you bring that up because my very next question then was the fact that obviously you open up the book talking about how evangelicals have understood themselves and how they may even describe or define themselves. And obviously, like you said, it's an impossible task to like figure out in a exact definition that everybody agrees upon, right? That's clearly not the case. But you must have had some sort of like operating definition or description of evangelicalism that you're using as you're writing the book. So, can you talk at least about like the best way, or at least the description or definition that you're using as you're writing the book? I'm really curious about that, knowing that obviously like it's not going to be the definitive definition or anything like that. But yeah, I'm curious what yours was that, as you were writing the book.
yeah, so this is the definitional debates are inherent to the story in a lot of ways, and that was one of the, as I said, was the discoveries that there was this thing going on about this wrangling over evangelical identity going way back, and for So I didn't. I don't even. There may be one place that I venture a kind of tentative. Here would be one way of describing
Right.
evangelicalism in the contemporary U.S. context. Um, the old joke that I reference in the book is that some evangelical historians used to use was that an evangelical in the U.S. context is anybody who likes Billy Graham. It's not a bad. It works up to a point, but it
Right.
also captures something, and it is that it captures lots. It captures a few things. One, that evangelicalism in the U.S. context in the 20th century and 21st century, which is primarily what I was focusing on, is this kind of nebulous trans-denominational movement, subculture or network of
Mm-hmm.
schools, publishing houses, record labels, institutions that have developed this, that are a network that developed specifically around this notion of evangelical identity. A thing that Gushy and I used in the Evangelical Ethics book that I think is a helpful way of even discussing this, like how to draw the lines and where to look in the U.S. context, is evangelical. The joke, I make this joke explicitly in the book, that it's actually like the judge says about hardcore pornography. Can't define it, but I know it when I
But when
see
I
it.
see it.
This is and like it's funny, but it is also, to your, as you were talking about, listeners coming out of the evangelical worlds. Um, it's it's even got it's like its own language, right? There's like
Right. Oh, totally.
idiomatic phrases where, like, if somebody says a certain kind of phrase, you're like, huh,
Yeah.
that. And they themselves may not even say, I am evangelical. They may not even use the language, but it's, which
But if you're
conference.
doing life together, I
This is
know
it,
what
right?
you might mean.
This is exactly one of them, right? God has laid something on your heart. These kinds
Right.
of doing life together, these kinds of phrases are an idiomatic culture thing in evangelical circles, and it indicates something. This is a long-winded way of saying that, I don't venture a definition per se as like a definitive, but I suggest, in the 20th century context in the U.S., what evangelicalism became is this network of institutions that is a trans-denominational group of Christians that generally, the kind of initial defining border guarding that happened with evangelical leaders was around conservative. We are conservative Christians, not like those liberal Christians. And then part of the story of the book is making an argument about how that network made decisions about more specific things to add to the definition of what a true evangelical is over time.
Right.
So yeah, the definition, that if I'm working with the definition in the book, it is generally evangelicalism, as it is represented in the book that I'm focusing on, is one way to talk about it, it's a discourse. It's a discourse in 20th century Protestant Christianity about, who is in some ways, one of the discourses about who's a true Christian, because that's how evangelical identity often gets
Totally.
wielded in certain circles.
Absolutely.
This is still a long way of maybe dodging your question.
It's totally fine. It's not the first person to dodge a question that I ask, and probably rightfully so,
All
dodging it.
good.
I just saw Kristen Dumais recently, and she was talking about how evangelicals, the sort of leaders of evangelicalism, often want to define evangelicalism theologically, right? And there's
Uh-huh.
like the Bebbington or whatever that guy's name
Right.
is. Like there's all those kind of definitions. But what I like about what you're doing, and I think others do in trying to create some sort of description or definition of evangelicalism, is actually to talk about it culturally. Because if you look at the theological definitions of evangelicalism from the evangelical leaders, it really isn't all that different than what a lot of other Christians believe, even like Catholic Christians or mainline Protestant Christians, or even maybe some Eastern Orthodox Christians as well. Like, it's not all that different. So, what is it that differentiates evangelicalism, if it isn't just simply theological beliefs, from other Christians? I think it is something about the cultural artifacts that come up. It's the institutions, it's the media, it's the uh, yeah. You were kind of describing the kind of culture that is a part of evangelicalism, and that really seems to be what differentiates it from other Christian traditions. And so I really like that way of describing evangelicalism and thinking about evangelicalism. But the problem that I think evangelical leaders would have of that is then that's super amorphous, because it isn't actually just simply a theological definition. So evangelicalism is constantly changing if it's just simply a cultural definition, because culture changes all the time, right? And so that's where I can see like evangelical leaders being really hesitant of thinking it as a cultural definition or cultural that's what differentiates evangelicalism from other Christian traditions, because culture changes, and so
Yeah,
therefore evangelicalism is constantly changing as well.
yeah, 100%. And yes, and um, so an interesting thing to me around these questions of, so I actually um, I do a both, or personally, I would take a both and approach to this for a couple of reasons. One is I'm a little hesitant to definitively say this is culture, this is theology,
Right.
and draw the lines so neatly. I think that it is often more complicated than that. Human beings we're complex, and we have complex sets of motivations and preconceived notions and interests and desires and so on and so forth. And so this, whenever this question of yes, there are attempts to define it theologically, and some of what I narrate in the book involves those attempts, right, by evangelical leaders to say you must believe X, Y, Z, and that makes you an evangelical. The thing that I am in part think I am uncovering a little bit in the book is that it is also about power, right?
Mm.
That the definitions of evangelicalism, to Kristen Dumais' point about defining it theologically, um, that is an important point, and also a point that I would add is it may, even when it may be about theology, it's also about power,
Hmm.
such that those who are defining it theologically have the power to do so. And that's an important piece of this puzzle, I think, because
Totally.
there are junctures where you see the theological part of the story I end up telling is that, there are these folks who say, I fit your theological definition. I love these lost, forgotten evangelical figures, other evangelicals, some of those who I talk about, say things like, um, I believe in the authority of the Bible. I believe in Jesus. I've accepted Jesus. I would meet any of your theological criteria, and yet I vote slightly differently than you, or I'm black, or I'm a woman who wants to take a leadership role. And part of the story I tell is that when that happened, those folks got marginalized and defined out of the category, even if they could meet all of the theological criteria. And those junctures are where I end up saying that this is an interesting thing around evangelical identity formation, because you get people who would say, yes, I am, and the Bevington quadrilateral or whatever. Yes, I agree with all pieces of those. And yet that wasn't enough for evangelical
Right.
leaders to accept me as a part of the religious community. So you get this like boundary drawing and redrawing around controversial issues, politics, race, sex, gender, any of the fun stuff. So that in part is really does get at the heart of the argument, that there is this it may be theological at times. There is that piece that it is, folks in evangelical institutions are sometimes required to sign statements of faith or whatever, and those may be primarily theological. But some of the, and I do talk about some of that story. Some of the interesting places to me are where even at the times where it is supposedly theological, and I don't, it may be in part theological, it is at least also about power,
Right.
is kind of one of my driving points.
Mm-hmm. And this specific conversation about identity within evangelicalism, I think, is also just a broader conversation of what happens with Christians. And I get it all the time. People are always constantly telling me, "You're not a Christian. You're not a Christian because you don't believe X, Y, and Z or whatever." And how how we navigate somebody that says, "Hey, I'm a Christian for X, Y, and Z reasons," but they say you have to believe X, Y, and Z other reasons to be a Christian, and how you navigate that is really, really interesting. And again, I think this is like a certain version, this evangelical identity formation is a certain version of that. But let's talk about those other stories that that you talk about in the book, and I want to go through each one of these. So
Yeah,
let's talk just briefly a little bit about each one of these folks. So you again, you divide the book by liberal evangelicals, black evangelicals, progressive evangelicals, feminist evangelicals, and gay evangelicals. So let's talk about the liberal ones first. Those damn liberals. What's the story you want to tell about the liberal evangelicals?
Yeah. So this, and you say those damn liberals, and that you are naming something, that joke is naming something that is a part of the story that I'm telling there. And it is
Right.
this. It is that one of the primary evangelical identity formation, like tools in the 20th century, was to define evangelical as not liberal.
Mm.
Right? Evangelical Christians are not liberal Christians. And so what I argue in part is that the first move in the kind of institutionalization of 20th century evangelical identity is to draw a line between conservative, faithful evangelical Christians over here and those liberal apostates over there, right? And it was in part around things like those liberal Christians over there believe that you can use critical methods to study the Bible, and those
Right.
liberals over there believe that you may not need to read Genesis as a literal scientific account of a 6-day creation. And an early move in this institutionalization of evangelical identity is to say those people are not evangelical, and evangelical means this over here.
Which
And
is it's hilarious because when the fundamentalist evangelical split happened, right, the evangelicals were considered the liberal ones.
well, this
And
is
now they're weaponizing that same accusation that they once received, and now they're weaponizing that against others.
so this is the shifting thing, right? Where it's always the case that it is in the 20th century context, liberal became a bad word in evangelical circles, almost universally so.
Right.
So anytime one party could paint the other party as liberal, that was an incredibly effective rhetorical strategy. The interesting thing to me for that chapter was that, and this is one of those discoveries that I made in the research, that it was just like a fascinating piece because I had never seen it discussed in evangelical history books of evangelicalism at all. And it was the case that there were liberal Christians who would self-identify in some way as liberal, saying, yes, we are Christian and we accept historical critical methods for studying the Bible, and we don't think that challenges our faith, and we accept modern scientific methods and theory, like theories of Darwinian evolution and so on, and that doesn't change that we're Christian. And also there were some such liberal Christian thinkers who held on to evangelical identity, saying essentially, we believe we're faithful to the gospel. That kind of the original etymological meaning of evangelical, meaning the good news. That just because we accept historical critical methods and Darwinian evolution, that doesn't mean that we're not faithful to the gospel of Jesus. And these folks are absolutely written out of evangelical history because of this idea that the mainline liberals are over here and evangelicals are over here. And part of what that chapter is doing is making this argument that it was messier for a period of time, that there were folks who were saying, who weren't accepting that divide, who were saying you don't get to define us out of this category just because we accept historical critical methods to study the Bible. So that chapter is one of the I think I said to somebody the other day, any of the chapters has the potential to be the most controversial given it matters what the context is, but this one definitely will because it is in some ways playing a little bit with the kind of widely accepted history of 20th century Protestantism to say that it's actually this neat line between evangelicals over here and liberal mainliners over there was actually more complicated. It wasn't always so neat.
What about what's the story you want to talk about with Black evangelicals?
This one is interesting for a number of reasons. One of which is to your point about theological definitions. A thing that happens when people start writing about evangelical history is often that you get historians who say things like, historically, the independent Black church traditions in this country have been theologically evangelical by any definition. And the problem with that is that looking at the 20th century context, which is what I was focusing on, you get Black Christians who might fit that theological definition who never associate with that label. Why is that, right? And one of the ways of understanding why that is in the story I'm telling is to look at Black Christians who did identify with the evangelical label. And there was a group of them, and they diagnosed as far back as the 1960s that there was something about evangelical culture and evangelical identity and those who identify as evangelical in the circles that was this cultural piece, right? That it was not, you get suggestion. Well, let me zoom out a little bit to talk a little bit about the folks. So the Black evangelicals that I end up focusing on in that chapter, many of them were the first Black Christians admitted to white fundamentalist and evangelical schools. And they were, for many of them, that was a very lonely experience. And then they started meeting other Black Christians who were the first admitted to white and evangelical schools. And they started conferring, and they started realizing that there was a similarity to their experience, that they were in these places and they were being taught evangelical theology. And actually what they began to realize is that they were being taught white evangelical theology because they would say, yes, we agree with these theological tenets. In fact, we identify with the evangelical label. And yet that was not enough for some reason. And why might that be? And it happened for these folks around. Some of them would say, yes, I meet all of your criteria, and yet you all constantly are poking me and prodding me about who I voted for or whether I support Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And they would frame it like white evangelicals would frame it, do you support those riots in the streets to these Black evangelicals as like a test of faith, such that even though they agreed with the theological tenets and even identified with the label, that wasn't enough. So you get somebody like Bill Pinnell, who writes this book all the way back in the 60s called My Friend the Enemy. And it's about white evangelicals are his friend the enemy, because it's this experience for him of working in evangelical circles and realizing that the culture was just absolutely riddled with racism and experiencing that firsthand. So he writes this book in the 60s that chapter is one of my favorites for a number of reasons, and this is one of them, that it prefigures, there's these debates currently about evangelicals and race that are happening right now. And this stuff goes all the way back to the 1960s,
Right.
where you have Black Christians who were making the same point. And part of the argument is that the nobody really listened to them, or they were, kind of written out of the history.
What about the progressive evangelicals? And I find that interesting that you do make that distinction between liberal and progressive. What's that distinction there that you're making?
It's actually for many of the folks who are featured in that chapter, it would be an important distinction for them, because that chapter is in part a history of the so-called evangelical left, which was a movement that predated in some ways the rise of the religious right. You had this like burgeoning, growing coalition of evangelicals with progressive politics before even the religious right like explodes onto the scene. And for many of those folks who would be the progressive evangelical leaders, it was very important to them to stress that they were theologically evangelical, and even some using like language of theological conservatism, saying we are theologically conservative, we love the Bible, and because we love the Bible and take it very seriously, we think that there are times you must not vote Republican. And that was very, very closely aligned for them with their evangelical identity, right? You get, this is Jim Wallace is a fairly famous name.
Ron Snyder. I guess I never thought about it that way, but they really did come at the same time that the religious right was on its rise. And it's really interesting to think that they were coming on the scene at the same exact time. So there was like these two largely vocal camps that were rising in evangelicalism. I've never really put that together. That's really interesting.
It's a wild thing, right? So folks generally know names like Jim Wallace and Ron Sider, but less known is the kind of history of their early work and their activism. And in that chapter, I draw on and am very thankful for earlier work by folks like Brantley Gasaway, David Swartz, who have written these fantastic histories of the evangelical left. I take a slightly different interpretive track for what happens to the evangelical left than they do, but their work is indispensable. And yes, to your point, it is the case that a lot of folks who would know the name Jim Wallace or Ron Sider are unaware that there was this movement of progressive evangelicals that was spreading and taking root, and it was predicated explicitly on, we are not liberal mainline Christians. We are classically evangelical by theological definition. We just think that you should support progressive political positions because that's more in line with the teachings of Jesus and with with somebody like Ron Sider, with the Bible's focus on wealth and poverty. Their biographical stories are fascinating in that Jim Wallace has this recounts how in the evangelical culture of the day that he experienced in his evangelical world growing up, he ran into the racism issue, and that turned him off to evangelical faith. And yet, before he decided to just do away with the whole thing, he gave the Bible one more chance. Sat down, read it through, and when he did, he said, this is part of his like self-narration, and several of the folks of the evangelical left, the way they self-narrate their story, they say, I looked at the Bible again and it radicalized me. When I read it for myself, I realized that the evangelical preaching and teaching I had been given was actually not in line with the, canonical emphases, right? Emphasizing, certain things over others, when if you look at the text, it seems like we should care about the poor. And this translated for this movement of progressive evangelicals into advocacy, anti-poverty advocacy, anti-racism advocacy, and anti-religious rights. Unfortunately, for these folks, what happened, I argue, is the religious right came on the scene and just steamrolled and destroyed all other options in evangelical spaces, such that it became the only game in town. part of the different kind of trajectory I take on telling that story is emphasizing that one of the effective ways that the religious right did that was by the kind of move you were talking about, folks coming up to you and saying you're not, XYZ, because XYZ, you're not really a Christian.
Right.
Religious right leaders did this to progressive
Mm-hmm.
evangelical leaders, and they did it incredibly effectively.
Right.
You get Jerry Falwell in front of a camera saying Jim Wallace is not really an evangelical, obviously. There's a direct quote from Jerry Falwell. Jim Wallace is an evangelical as an oak tree, and every time his diagnosis is based on politics, right? So you get another
Right.
interview with Jerry Falwell where he asks Jim Wallace, who did you vote for in these elections? Did you vote for Reagan? Did you vote for Bush? And then the turn is, well, see, you're obviously not an evangelical. And so this is, yeah.
I want to bookmark that for the next question because that's literally right in line of where I'm going to go. But I do want also to hear the story about the feminist and gay Christians too,
Yeah.
because obviously they have this story, or they're a part of this story as well, and it's incredibly important. Can you talk about just again, like, what's the story you want to tell about the feminist Christians or the feminist evangelicals?
Yeah. That chapter has, I think, a lot of resonance for a lot of current debates among evangelical circles, including stuff in part inspired by Kristen Dumais' book that has re-enlivened debates over gender roles and masculinity and chauvinism and
Mm-hmm.
misogyny in evangelical circles. And she made this incredible intervention that lays this thing out and says, look, this evangelical identity was driven by this manly man kind of thing, and this theology of tough guy masculinist theology. And part of what that chapter of the evangelical feminist story is doing is telling the underside of how that happened. Such that, much like the evangelical left, a lot of folks don't realize there was a growing feminist movement in evangelical circles through
Especially within the Southern Baptist Convention.
right. Yes, there's layers and layers to this, but there were feminists and or egalitarians, because sometimes, like liberal, feminist became a bad word in evangelical
Right.
circles. So sometimes folks would frame themselves as egalitarians rather than feminists, but the point stands. Much like the Black evangelicals story, and similar in some ways to the progressive evangelical story, you get these evangelical feminists who say, yes, we believe in the authority of the Bible. We just interpret those 2 or 3 passages in Paul about female submission and male authority slightly differently than you.
And we want to wear yoga pants.
Or preach or whatever, or support the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, and they say to the powers that be, we believe, actually, again, the witness of the Bible affirms the full equality of women, and citing things like Jesus having female followers, and this presented an interesting tension in the evangelical world of whether people with groups with two radically different interpretations of an issue like this could coexist. And part of what happened to the evangelical feminists, I argue, was the rise of complementarianism. The interesting thing about that, because that debate is very live again right now,
Right.
is that a lot of folks also probably don't realize is the complementarian movement is very recent. And that's I'm not even making some kind of wild interpretive claim there. The folks who were behind that movement were admit that they invented complementarianism in the late 80s as specifically a effort to eradicate evangelical feminism. The entire movement was predicated on the idea that they believed that feminist ideas were spreading among evangelicals and that was very dangerous, and they had to do something to stop it. And it really worked.
It really
such
did.
that in current debates about this stuff, the fact that there was a whole generation of evangelical feminists is pretty much totally forgotten.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually have a personal story to that. So I work for an institution called United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, and
yeah.
our president is Dr. Molly Marshall, and she was one of the first women that actually got ordained by the Southern Baptist Convention when the Southern Baptist Convention did open that up, and then obviously not too long later, the whole rise of the complementarian side of the Southern Baptist Convention gained a lot of power, and then they rescind that decision to allow women to get ordained. And so it's just really interesting to see how she was a major factor
Yeah.
in that feminist movement, specifically within the Southern Baptist Convention, which is hard to believe that it wasn't that long ago that there was a feminist movement within the Southern Baptist Convention. And this person who I work with every day, who is my president, was one of the major players in that.
Yeah. Yes. And I know lots of folks who know am one degree of separation removed from Molly Marshall in many ways. That I have known several of my friends and colleagues and professors and mentors over the years. She was an important figure for them. That is probably a podcast discussion for another day, because the Southern Baptist Convention is its own story in all of this puzzle that I didn't touch too much on in the book. But yes, this is it was the case that until fairly recently, there were significant pockets in the evangelical world of folks who were explicitly either egalitarian or admittedly feminist. And the complementarian stuff, the rise of folks like Wayne Grudem, John Piper, that whole thing, pushed that down the memory hole, and it worked. Their backlash was incredibly effective. And the whole complementarian he-man, she-woman, Bible, gender role thing became like, it spread like wildfire in evangelical circles, and feminists got marginalized. And that is, when we're back here in these debates and discussions today, it's interesting to see, the ways in which it's just picking up on previous debates that have been kind of completely forgotten.
Let's talk about now the gay evangelicals, which probably feels like almost like the least likely out of all of these, for some reason, just especially with like how much anti-LGBTQ movement there is, especially over the last like 20 years in evangelicalism. It feels like there's just no way there has been a gay evangelical, but they have a story in this. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about their story, and who's the I'm forgetting who was that huge early CCM artist who everybody like knew. There was like a recent like documentary about this guy.
Yeah.
Why am I blanking on his name? But he was gay, and
Yeah.
I think like openly gay, right?
Yeah. No, there's several instances of that even in the 20th century evangelical world, and the ones that we end up thinking about are sometimes the high profile, artists like Christian music artists coming out. And it does, though, relate to, the unlikeliness of it, when you were talking about that, does relate to the previous discussion we were just having about the complementarian stuff, because that rise of the gender role, strict gender binary stuff, and becoming widespread in evangelicalism went hand in hand with anti-gay animus.
Right.
So it is a fascinating chapter for a number of reasons, one of which is what was interesting to me was that there were folks going back into the 70s and 80s who were explicitly evangelical, who were saying, who were exploring the homosexuality question. And I put it in scare quotes because that's how it was framed at the time.
Right.
It was always, we're talking about homosexuality. And the interesting thing about that story is that for a time, it seems to me, this kind of negotiation among evangelical circles about what is going to be the evangelical response to homosexuality. At times, it's this kind of like, well, gay rights, homosexuality is the worldly, like that's that's obviously a sign that we're good. The culture is going to hell. The problem with like that, the holding it at arm's length thing, is that there's several, but in the kind of trajectory of the story I try to tell, the problem is that that didn't prohibit the gay kids growing up in evangelical churches. So that then, if it now is not something that is just happening out there, and it turns out there are gay Christians in the pews, what are the evangelical leaders? What are we going to say to them? One of the most interesting things about that chapter to me is, and it also ties to some current debates in evangelicalism, you see this move by the quote unquote moderate evangelical leaders to say, folks like Jerry Falwell, who say gays are going to hell, they deserve to go to hell, this is that kind of rhetoric. You get this move by quote unquote more moderate evangelical leaders to say, we can't react like that. That's not good. That's not loving. What can we do that is loving? Well, we cannot affirm this lifestyle. So what are we going to do? And part of the story I end up telling is is how it is that the ex-gay movement became the like mainstream evangelical answer, as like, this is a way we as moderate evangelicals can minister to gay people, is by helping them change. Now, the interesting part of that there's many interesting parts of that trajectory, but one of which is that the whole thing kind of fell apart. The ex-gay movement, not that some of that ideology is not still out there, but over time, the open secret was that these folks were not changing their sexual orientation, and such that even now you have
they ended up partnering together. Like, that's what happened.
and you get so some of those folks who would have come out of the ex-gay movement, such that they were ex-gay, I tell us a little bit of some of their stories in that chapter as gay evangelicals, right? Who then were ex-gay evangelicals, who then became ex-gay evangelicals because they realized that this conversion therapy thing wasn't really working. The interesting thing about the fall of the ex-gay movement is that open secret increasingly became less of a secret and more out in the open. And then you get acknowledgement from even somebody like Russell Moore, who would meet any of the conservative criteria, saying, yeah, the ex-gay, this reparative therapy, changing orientation thing doesn't really show any indication that this actually works, and acknowledging that. And the other interesting piece of that chapter, though, is to emphasize that there were people going back to the 70s, including folks like Ralph Blair and Virginia Mollenkott, who were beginning to make arguments that, yes, we are Christian and we are evangelical Christians. That is our tradition and our community, and we agree to XYZ theological points. We just don't believe that those 6, whatever passages have any bearing on lifelong monogamous same-sex relationships. And making the argument that one interpretive difference should not be enough to disqualify them from being called evangelical. Now, that argument absolutely was one that was targeted by folks who would say, well,
that got steamrolled pretty easily.
100%. And an interesting phenomenon, though, with that is, much like all these other debates that we've talked a little bit about, you get a kind of resurgence of that debate in the last decade with folks like Matthew Vines or Justin Lee or David Gushee, who are making similar kinds of arguments around Christians should be able to support same gender loving relationships. And the thing that happened to all those folks is what happened to each of these previous versions of other evangelicals. They were targeted, and the arguments were explicitly made that obviously these aren't real evangelicals. So yeah.
Which again goes to show the identifier among evangelical leaders. Again, it doesn't seem like it's all that particularly theological in a lot of ways, because because what they think is theological is changing, right? Complementarianism used to not exist. And then in the 90s, it does. And now that becomes, if you're not a complementarian, you're not an evangelical. But that didn't exist in evangelical history prior to that. So there's this changing that happens. And so it really is, again, like you mentioned before, it's a power play. It's whatever we can do to have power. And so if that means our theology, culture, whatever it needs to change in order for us to have power, that's what's going to be the case. And so they ultimately are the ones that seem to be the gatekeepers of what's evangelical and what's not. But it's very amorphous. It's very subjective about what actually, for them, what they even consider to be evangelical. It's just about what they think, what's going to keep them in power.
One of the kind of inherent things that makes that possible specifically in the evangelical world is that the evangelicalism is not a denomination. It doesn't have an official hierarchy and or official creeds. So it requires this kind of posturing around even theological positions because there is no universally agreed upon set of criteria, right? Or membership roles. Now,
Right.
there are institutions that try to institute that, or that, that kind of plant their flag as, if you're a member of this institution, you're an evangelical theologian or whatever. But all of that trajectory, though, consistently had this problem where it was very consistently a kind of minimal consensus theologically, like inerrancy. Anybody who agrees in the inerrancy, this was regularly one of the litmus tests. If you
Right.
can affirm inerrancy, you're an evangelical. But then the problem always came up about interpretation. That's, what do you do with two evangelicals who say, yes, we agree in the authority with the authority of the Bible, and we are participants in this community, and we reach radically different conclusions about the implications of an inerrant Bible, or about this passage, or about that passage, or about whether Calvinism, free will, open theism, right? These debates happen even and some of that in the dissertation. I had some of this that got cut out of the book that was specifically around evangelical debates about open theism, Calvinism, that kind of stuff, because the same phenomenon happened there, where it would be the case that you would have people who say, yes, I agree with the authority of the Bible and I meet all of these theological criteria, and yet I disagree about the way that God works in the world in terms of predestination or planning or foreknowledge.
Right.
And that presents a tension where all of a sudden you have this religious community with people with pretty profoundly different, like a pluralism of evangelical ideas. And evangelical leaders were 20th century evangelical gatekeepers, those who positioned themselves as gatekeepers, were uncomfortable with that pluralism, right?
Mm.
And so often you get it becomes a power move where those in power get to set the terms of what counts as an officially sanctioned evangelical interpretation. And the culture making thing is a fascinating piece of it, because you can see the way it functions, where somebody will advocate a different interpretation and then their book is pulled off the shelf and they don't get sold anymore.
Totally.
Or a CCM artist, right, makes one claim, their CDs are gone. Lifeway doesn't sell them anymore.
Right.
And part of the whole argument of the book is that kind of thing has had a profound impact on what it means to be a capital E official evangelical.
It feels like it all came to a head with the 2016 election and Trump. Like, it really feels like all of the history of evangelicalism was just heading to that point, right? And so all of these things that we're talking about just come to a head at this moment. Can you talk a little bit about how Trump's election either like highlights or magnifies what it means to be an evangelical, and what that means maybe going forward for people who identify as evangelical? Because one of my like sort of theories essentially is that evangelicalism, especially over the last 20 years, I would say even more closer to 10 years, there used to be a cultural element to it, right? To be evangelical meant that you weren't listening to Blink 182, you were listening to Reliant K. Instead of watching Barney, you were watching VeggieTales, right? There was this cultural element to it, and we've talked about that before. But then all of a sudden, you get this guy who basically now is the new evangelical leader who never read Wild at Heart. He clearly did not do any purity culture. He was not saving himself for marriage, right? And all of a sudden now he's the key evangelical in the country. And so it seems like all the cultural pieces to what made us evangelical went to the wayside just for power. So I'm curious like how that change of how evangelicals even understood themselves and what was changing in evangelicalism, um, it all culminated with Trump with that. And so and it seems like moving forward now, like there's a reason why we don't really see the cultural artifacts that used to exist in evangelicalism like it did. I mean, we still have CCM for the most part, but we don't. The Christian music festivals, almost all of them are gone. VeggieTales is not even like a Christian media company anymore, right? Like there are, I guess, like large Christian books being sold,
Yeah, right,
or
right.
you know, evangelical books, but a lot of like the cultural pieces that I grew up with no longer exist. And
Yeah,
so
that's
what does
interesting.
it mean to be an evangelical moving forward, especially post 2016?
Yeah, that's an interesting. And I hadn't really thought about the kind of like fracturing of the coherence of that particular aspect of the culture, actually. So that's a really interesting point and insight you make, that yeah, I want to think about that
Yeah, like
particular piece.
I think about like who the average youth group kid right now in a
Yeah,
big
yeah, this is
evangelical
interesting.
megachurch.
Yeah,
Like when I was growing up, it
right,
meant that you were listening to Tooth and Nail artists,
right, right.
that you grew up listening to VeggieTales, right? Like there was a whole culture. You would go to all the big youth conferences,
Yeah,
Dare to Share
passion,
and Acquire the
passion.
Fire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's what it meant. That was those were the pieces to being evangelical as a youth group kid. What is that for a kid now? Like
Yeah,
you listen to Lauren Daigle, maybe like that. Like that's maybe it. Like
yeah.
I don't know what it means for an average youth group kid to be evangelical, and I think that is just a microcosm of the larger culture of things have changed dramatically.
Yeah.
And so is it really just that you vote Republican? Like is that what it means now moving forward from 2016?
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing around the 2016 election, in particular, as a kind of watershed. And there is no, some people are getting hung up in debating like, oh, we got to stop focusing on 2016. But there's no avoiding that this was a watershed moment in American culture and politics, and particularly in terms of Christian and evangelical culture. But this by 2006, there's a few ways I think to think about it. And one of the interesting things that I do in the conclusion is talk about this question of the 81%, right? The
Mm-hmm.
81% of evangelicals. In some ways, the evangelical vote for Trump, based on the story I was telling, is not surprising. By 2016, evangelicals are the evangelical, those who would identify as evangelical by the pollsters metric, or how sociologists cut that pie, have been the most consistent Republican voting bloc for many elections.
Yes.
So the fact that, as particularly in the presidential election, so when you get time for the final, the down to the wire of two candidates, and one is Republican and one is a Democrat, in some ways it's not surprising that those who would self-identify as evangelical voted Republican. And yet you do get this before and after and in the lead up thing that is happening among evangelical leaders and self-identified evangelicals and younger evangelicals and evangelicals of color, where the recognition, and your point about the cultural artifacts is so huge here, and I hadn't thought about Trump particularly in this way. He is not just a theological outsider, he's a cultural outsider to
Correct.
all. This is not somebody who can talk the idiomatic talk, right? In a way that communicates to evangelical Christians that he's one of them, which would be a slightly different strategy, politically, than somebody like George W. Bush, who
Right.
who had
Totally.
an affect and a way of speaking that said that evangelicals could hear and say, yes, he sounds like me, in some capacity, like whatever the idiomatic tags are. So this is the interesting thing, and you get these dividing lines between evangelical leaders who are debating in the lead up to Trump, like whether they can support him or not, and some start in one camp and then end up in another camp. I think part of what was happening was as simple as evangelical identity became by the 21st century very closely aligned with Republican politics. And it's the story I tell in the progressive evangelical chapter in some ways, such that while there might still have continued to be some diversity of evangelical political opinion, to be a Democrat and an evangelical by the time you get to the 21st century made you suspect.
Right.
Right? It just did. And that's not to say that there weren't, Ron Sider still till the end of his days was always identified as evangelical, as far as I know, and advocated progressive politics. And yet he never could escape people like those in the evangelical culture who said that made his faith suspect. So when you get to, in some ways, right, like that's the simple answer to evangelicals were going to vote Republican because that's how this story has happened. It was not always the case that evangelical meant essentially a Protestant Christian who votes Republican, but an argument can be made that that is the meaning, and if not meaning, at least strong connotation of this label and identity.
Yeah.
Post 2016, one and fascinating, and I had this discussion with somebody else the other day, you see this wild phenomenon where you get people who are Catholic or Muslim identifying as evangelical now. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what is going on there is the story I'm telling, which is evangelical identity became associated with a kind of identity politics. And often it was a white identity politics. And it meant things like we are conservative Christians who want to protect the family.
Right.
Anti-abortion, anti-feminism, pro-free market, anti-socialism, anti-communism.
Right.
And that identity, Christian is a piece of it, but one can make the argument that the stronger piece is these political, social artifacts and political positions, and an argument can be made that the political platform is one of the strongest kind of glue that holds evangelical identity together. And so when Trump comes along, he just points out some of the fissures there, right? Where it's like, oh, hold on, there are some evangelical leaders who made these arguments about the importance of personal morality for their religious leaders. Now you have this guy. Right. In the wake of Trump, it is it's an interesting time, right? In for the future of evangelicalism, because it revealed some fault lines that may have been there all along, and maybe was a strong indicator of what this thing actually has become.
Right. It's just fascinating to me that for the last 50 years, evangelicals have been building these institutions, whether it's educational institutions, cultural, media institutions. They've built up all these institutions for 50 years. And now we get to a point now where to be evangelical doesn't mean that you have to participate in those institutions anymore. Now, evangelicalism has always, at least in the last 50 years, there's been obviously a majority of them where it meant to be conservative theologically and politically, right? But it also meant participating in the institutions they were creating. But you no longer have to participate in those institutions. In fact, some of those institutions don't exist anymore. And so that's where it's just like, what is going to happen in the future of evangelicalism identity, given the fact that their institutions that they've spent millions and billions of dollars building for the last 50 years don't matter anymore.
Yeah. And I wonder there, and now we're really getting to some fun theorizing, and we can do this together. I wonder there if some of that is internet, right? If some of the rise of access via the internet to, and not purely. I'm we can't just blame internet for everything, but it's, for a long time, that cohesion of the evangelical culture, you go to the conference, you listen to the music or whatever, in some ways, folks don't need that as much to feel like they are participating in some kind of culture, some kind of niche cultural thing, in part because of online stuff, right? Because what you're talking about, a lot of this was strongly driven by physical, like you buy the CDs
Right.
at the Christian bookstore, you go to the youth group
Yeah. You go
night,
to Liberty. You don't take classes online at Liberty, right?
you go
Yeah.
to you make your pilgrimage to the Passion Conference in Atlanta. And it has this, so I would suspect that one can make an argument that some of the shifting nature of culture formation in the modern U.S. context would be at play in the evangelical world. But I think you're onto something here where I think it's more than that with the evangelical world. And yeah, what the future looks like for it is interesting, because there's like lots of these folks are making the prognostications about what evangelical identity and stuff looks like moving ahead. And and a really interesting thing, at least as far as I've seen some of the sociological data, and I talk about the interesting debates among sociologists about how to define evangelical, but from what I've seen, there's not like a dip in people identifying as evangelical post-Trump. In fact, it's holding steady or slightly increasing in maybe in some numbers, and that's a fascinating thing. But to your point about the participation, I think one of the indicators, at least based on the sociological data I've just kind of seen from a distance, is that there are folks that the self-identified evangelicals include lots of people who never attend church. That would be a strong indication of the point that you're making, where these people at least consider themselves evangelicals and are not in those youth groups and are not buying CCM, or maybe they are buying CCM, listening to Lauren Daigle on Spotify or whatever.
And if that continues to grow, at some point, then we just need to recognize the fact that maybe to be evangelical it's a political identifier, specifically maybe a power identifier. It's just simply what is going to give you access to more power, or at least more political power. And it seems like that might be like the trend that we're heading towards. It seems like that, especially as evangelical institutions clearly are not a part of evangelical identity anymore.
Right. And it's that interesting evolution is, I'll be thinking about this a lot now. The another angle, and I didn't do too much with this in the book, but some folks have started writing about this. A strong argument can be made that evangelical became like a consumer culture, such that it is, if you can get that if you can get into the networks of the things that are sold to evangelical Christians, there is an identity being sold, right? I think that this, and it would have to do with the idioms, right? Like the cutesy little, an aesthetic. You can make an argument that there's an evangelical aesthetic, right? And and how that will change given the realities you're talking about, participation in institutions or not, is a really fascinating. And the internet, I assume, plays a role there, where the proliferation of an evangelical aesthetic. I'm thinking like the Chip and Joanna. What is their thing? The Gaines, the people, the Fixer Upper thing in Waco, Texas.
Oh yeah. I forget what that. I know what you're talking about, but it's this like the good looking guy with the undercut and the
feels very even. Yeah. Right. And
like that is so a part of what it means to be, or at least at one point seemed to be evangelical.
Yeah, and I think that there is an argument to be made for some of that the internet is definitely changing that, in that mega church culture was always a piece of this puzzle, but it feels like now it's even more so, such that you have a few culture making institutions, like maybe fewer than there used to be, but they're more influential perhaps, right? Like there was just a recent somebody published a study about it's like 4 outfits that make all of the worship music that evangelicals are singing now, right?
Yeah.
So
like
maybe
Bethel, Hillsong, and whatever other ones, but yeah, that's about it.
And some of that is marketing. Those are institutions that are incredibly effective, are incredibly effective marketing their product. and getting it out there. And they are, to take slightly devil's advocate on your argument, the evangelical culture making is still happening. It's just happening in slightly different ways and with maybe different players, and maybe there are fewer players, and maybe it is, now if you listen to Bethel and whatever, that is, I don't know. This is just like theorizing at this point, because this is such a fascinating question.
Well, so here's my like sort of counter argument, at least to that in particular, is that evangelicals for a number of years created a counterculture of their own music, their own media. Right. What they're doing now is they're taking the mainstream media and trying to convert them. That's why you see Justin Bieber, Kanye West, Chris Pratt. They're taking mainstream culture and bringing it into theirs and trying to convert them to theirs.
Yeah, interesting.
Right? And so it's not that they're creating their alternative culture. They are simply just trying to convert mainstream culture.
Interesting. Because that, that tension is always there too, though, in evangelicalism, of the those who take the more, we got to convert the world approach, and or developing the counterculture. And to your point about the formation of a counterculture, that absolutely 100% was the case. And that element of the baptizing of what, metaphorically or literally baptizing other outsider cultural artifacts is that's an interesting thing. Yeah. And
maybe it's more so that the degree to which the amount of resources are going into one or the other, right? At one point it seemed like evangelicals for the most part were putting as much resources into creating a counterculture, alternative culture, rather than trying to baptize or convert the mainstream culture. Whereas now it seems like, because so much of those countercultural institutions have been abandoned or have completely gone in decline, that they now are putting more resources into the baptizing or conversion of mainstream culture.
Yeah. And I think there is something to that. And I think that there's a way that you can make that argument related to like the gender role stuff, right? Or the Mars Hill phenomenon, right? That was Mars Hill's whole thing, was like, we're going to be the cool, like we are countercultural in a certain way. And that element is always there, right? Positioning against those, liberal commies, soy boys, whatever. We're gonna have an alternative culture thing, but it makes for interesting allegiances where, and I think the internet definitely has played a role here, where you see very fascinating bedfellows developing these days, where
Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, right? Like that's what is so interesting is, again, like at one point you had to be an evangelical to be influential in evangelicalism.
Right.
And now that seems to, for the most part, be changing pretty dramatically.
Yeah. And so there is so if you, a beginning theory here is like, okay, let's scratch down to the surface and have some understanding of why that is. And I think some of it would relate to the story I'm trying to tell, right? Jordan Peterson is saying things that make the folks who believe a certain kind of gender ideology feel like this is another somebody who affirms their gender ideology, right? So an argument, I have made the argument before, that one of the almost the foremost controlling project of evangelical theology in the late 20th and early 21st century is this defense of complementarianism, right? Such that to do evangelical theology is to be prepared to defend a gender ideology in theological terms. So you get interesting bedfellows, right? And that somebody who's a Jordan Peterson who says men should be XYZ and women should do ABC becomes a guru in evangelical circles, which is a fascinating thing. And I think maybe your theoretical piece about this culture, this shifting of the cultural formation is maybe onto something. This is fascinating thing to watch, and people should be, I beat this drum all the time. People should be paying attention to this, because it's the spread of a lot of this connects to spread of far right ideas.
Yeah, that's why I'm like so fascinated by this, because it really does, like, and I think we should be really concerned about it, is because the fact that we're seeing evangelicalism and its identity change so much, I think has massive implications of the kind of power it has politically, and therefore could end up in policies that really end up destroying a lot of this world. Like, that's why I'm so concerned about it. Like, I just am like, whew, this is really scary to me.
No, this is
Like,
right. Yeah.
Trump is a culmination, but I think what's happening, I think Trump is a microcosm of what really is happening, and that is evangelical identity is changing, and I think not in a way that's going to be really helpful at all to a world that's already plagued by climate change and white supremacy and so on and so forth.
I think that there's certainly something to that, and I think that I talk a bit about kind of what's next for evangelicalism in the
Right.
conclusion. I don't make too many prognostications, except that I think in the very last little bit I go for if I had to predict, I would not predict that that evangelical identity is going to change in a certain kind of way, and the way that I am describing is that there is going to be room for reform of certain tendencies and or an opening of the tent, where all of a sudden those who would say I am gay and evangelical or I'm feminist and evangelical are going to be able to make space in that world, because generationally there is this, there is some of that, I think, that is happening. It's not purely generational, but there is a bit where a generation of kids who is raised evangelical sees what has happened in the past 10 years and says, you taught me XYZ. This culture shaped me in a certain way. I thought character matters, but now it seems like, this is that only power matters. And I, don't know how I feel about Christianity, but I definitely don't like misogyny and racism and this kind of stuff. And those folks, the like in the conclusion, what I end up saying, I think, is that it's not a really cheery outlook, but my view is that those folks, the folks who would feel that way and might want to stay and try to reform evangelicalism from the inside, are probably not going to be successful, because evangelical
Yeah.
leadership are doubling down right now
Yes.
on
Yes.
everything I just talked about. The
Yes.
stories that is, there is recognition that younger evangelicals are rejecting some of this stuff, and the response from many at the top is to double down on this stuff.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I was going to bring that up of I don't remember the exact figure, but I think David Gushee has brought this up before, of like something like 25 million people have left evangelicalism over the last, like, I don't know how many years, but like an absurd number, right? And even the Southern Baptist Convention has like consistently over the last number of years lost a
It's
million
declining,
members
yeah.
each year. And so there clearly is this mass exodus. Have we seen something like this in evangelicalism before, where there are so many people leaving? And I just find that really interesting. Obviously, and that's part of my story, right? Like, I'm one of those people, and I would say probably most of my listeners are one of those people. And we now even see like an entire movement. It's not just like a bunch of people leaving. There's an entire kind of cohesive movement happening, the ex-evangelical movement.
Right.
And has something like that ever happened before?
So there's so many, we could talk about this for hours and hours, because there's so many interesting angles to this. And I think that Exodus piece is there. And yet also that the interesting thing is it will probably take a while, because it will probably take a while to see what that means, for a few reasons, and one of which is it depends on how you slice it, right? Because to the other point that I was making earlier, some sociological data seems to indicate that evangelical numbers are holding at least steady. So if there are those who are leaving, there are
Just as
new,
many coming in.
yeah. Now
Yeah.
those are probably not the same kinds of folks, so that has implications. But this question of in some way, this question of the precedent, right? In some ways, the stories I'm telling, some of the folks of the stories I tell in the book ended up being ex-evangelical before long, decades ago.
Right.
Some got pushed out, some decided to voluntarily leave. But this like official movement kind of thing of like yes, there is many of we are legion and we are leaving because XYZ, at least in the 20th century context of US evangelicalism, not really that I'm aware of. It was a story of kind of like evangelicalism became the hot thing where all like, by the 70s and 80s, everybody's like, oh yeah, evangelicals are everywhere. Now that is an interesting story to me because where did those people come from? And so I also make a bit of an argument that this evangelical identity thing was an invention, and it was a really effective invention because a lot of people who would have, maybe before been like, I'm Lutheran or I'm Southern Baptist, now are like, I'm evangelical. And it was a really effective thing that like united various Christians from various denominations in this kind of culture making project. The so yeah, I don't think that there is in that particular story. I don't know that there is precedent for like a mass exodus. And yeah, I think it remains to be seen what is happening with evangelicals and ex-evangelicals and post-evangelicals,
Right.
and because we are at an interesting cultural moment with it where there is no question it's changing, and it's going to be fascinating to see what happens, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, if there's anything that gives an indication of, I think, what's going to happen to these folks that just I feel like I'm at the margins of evangelicalism, like you talk about in all these different stories of folks, is yeah, like at the end of the day, they have not been successful at reform, right? There's just very few folks that have been able to be in any way, shape, or form successful in reforming. And so, if history is any indication, I think you're right. I don't think moving forward we're going to see really any successful reform of this tradition, which part of me is like really mourns that because of how much evangelicalism formed me as a child. But part of me is just like, I don't know what there is to reform at this point anymore. Like clearly it's never been successful. And even like the closest things that we've seen, like the emergent church movement being like one of the closer things that we saw of maybe something really about to happen. And then that gets squashed down too. So it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's just really disheartening and frustrating. And also at the same time, I think at some point we just kind of have to swallow the pill of this might not be a reformable tradition.
There could have been a
And so, yeah, I think
yes.
you're onto it.
To your point, there could have been a chapter about the emergent church as other evangelicals, as a movement for certain kinds of philosophical and or liturgical reform to evangelicalism that became a hot thing that everybody was talking about for a moment, and then nobody really talks about it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I
And
will. I'm actually still part of an emergent church, and so I will gladly talk about. I am so fascinated by it, and also I realize most people are probably like so not interested in it.
no, I mean it is fascinating to me, and for a number of personal and professional reasons. I've very dear, probably my best friend in the entire world works at UBC Waco, which was
Mm-hmm.
one of the early kind of emergent stuff around specifically worship music,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Was that Crowder's?
yeah.
Okay.
So this is check him out, Jameson McGregor. I'll do a shameless plug for a friend here. He's worship and arts pastor at UBC Waco, and yeah, this is the emergent church thing is an example of this. Like it was a concerted effort to reform a certain aspect of evangelicalism. And again, well, and this is a good place to make this point. To any of the stories I tell, I try to walk. It's a fine line to walk, but I also say, I'm not saying feminist evangelicals don't exist anymore, or that one can't be evangelical and feminist, or gay and evangelical, or whatever. I am just talking so this is the emergent church would be a good example of. There are folks still involved, I think, in that kind of project, but as a kind of movements that had, at least in some capacity, efforts to change the landscape, it I'm sure in ways it did, but it also like had serious backlash
Right.
that pushed a lot of the folks, I imagine, out of the efforts.
Mm-hmm.
I think about somebody like Brian McLaren as an interesting figure to me, because I don't even know if he would identify as evangelical anymore.
Right.
And that's a fast, that's a, like, he was a widely respected evangelical teacher for a long time, and he got in trouble a lot for, you
Mm-hmm.
know, for suggesting alternative interpretations of ways
Right.
of being the church and being Christian. And yeah, I don't know. I haven't talked to, I've met Brian McLaren once or twice, but I haven't talked to him in many years. I would be curious, if somebody like that is now an other evangelical in the history of evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that whole movement is really interesting, and yeah, I would love to see some sort of history around that. I think Homebrew Christianity, Trip Fuller's podcast, is going to be doing some sort of history around the emergent church movement, and
Yeah, that's
again, it was very
fascinating.
formative for me while I was in college, and to the point where I started working at an emergent church at Solomon's Porch in Minneapolis, and so and I'm still a part of the church. So it really formed a lot, and also it feels like it's one of these stories.
Yeah, it could have been. It could have been a
Yeah,
chapter or a
absolutely.
whole book.
Or it could be a whole book. But Isaac, I feel like I've taken way too much of your time. Last question: how can listeners get connected to you and your work, and where should they get the book?
Yeah, no, this is a blast. We'll have to do some of this again sometime.
Absolutely.
There's other avenues we could trace too, because I have this other. It's not directly related to this book, but my time working and teaching at Union Seminary, and I have interests that would probably converge with other things you and your listeners talk about around liberation theologies, and
Absolutely.
I actually. This will be the last side note, and then I'll answer your question. Taught with James Cone. I was one of his last TAs here at Union.
Oh, lovely.
So yeah, there's
That's awesome.
plenty of stories, other stories we can talk that are adjacent to this story. But to find me, Twitter, unfortunately, sadly, is my most frequent social media place, even though
We can be our little like trash can raccoons out
it
there
is a
in
mess.
Twitterland
It is a
together.
mess, but it is still probably the place that is easiest to find me on social media. It's Isaac B. Sharp. And that handle goes across any others of the places you can find me. And the book is available. I think the official line is wherever books are sold. Erdman's is the publisher, so the website has it, but Barnes and Noble, local bookstores, lots of local bookstores are starting to have it. If you have a favorite local bookstore, ask and request it, because the easiest place to find it is Amazon, and that is what it is. So yeah.
Love it. Well, Isaac, unbelievable book. Again, growing up in the evangelical world, it's just super fascinating to me to see what has happened to it. And these stories of liberal and black and progressive and feminist and gay evangelicals is very much a part of that story. And so just thank you so much for sharing those stories. I mean, they're just so important. So thank you again. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.